Welcome to this recorded extract from the first session of Encountering God, as we began our journey through Module 2, Section 1 of the Worship, Leading and Preaching online course, this section entitled Reading the Bible. And in this extract, you will hear an introduction to the material from Liz, a comprehensive look at the timeline of the Bible and how the Bible came to be put together from David, an explanation of the word hermeneutics from James, and then an in-depth conversation between James and Carol around one particular passage in the Gospel. There are also some slides with additional information from time to time during the video. Apologies that in some cases you're hearing the original audio rather than seeing the original video from the session. This is to avoid having participants' faces on the screen. So I hope you find this helpful, and please do keep in touch with us as we continue to accompany you on this exciting journey.
Yeah, so I'm just going to begin with a few minutes talking about the aims and objectives of what and outcomes that we're trying to achieve today, and then a short presentation on the Bible and a little bit about what we'll be doing. So I'm just going to hopefully screen share. I am a little rusty, so let's see if we can get it right. All right. Right, does that look good? Can I have a thumbs up? Thank you. Okay, so as Christians, the Bible is central to our faith, and we look to it for inspiration, guidance, and teaching. However, the Bible is a rich and complex book, and understanding its message can be challenging. In this module section, we shall begin to develop some techniques and skills for studying the Bible in greater depth, so that we can communicate the truth of the word in our worship and our preaching and our daily lives. So the main aims of Module 2 from Worship, Learning and Preaching 3.0 is to offer an introduction to the Bible and its authority, to lay foundations for a theologically informed reading and interpretation of the Bible. And the proposed outcomes are to give an overview of the structure, origin and context of the canonical scriptures, including their genres and cultural and historical contexts, and to describe a range of different models of biblical authority and explain how you personally allow the Bible to speak with authority. If you have had a look at session 0, then you were invited to do an exercise as shown here on the slide, where you were asked to look at 5 different publications and how we use them differently. So like I've got there a cookbook, a map, newspaper, instruction manual, novel and a dictionary. And we thought about how we use different publications and different books in different ways. Do we read it cover to cover like a novel? If it was, we wouldn't read well, certainly my husband wouldn't read an instruction manual at all, let alone read it cover to cover. But things go out of date, so maps, we often have to get new maps because of when they were produced. Things have changed and move on. So do we just dip into things from time to time? And how much authority do we give to each publication? For me, there are some cookbooks and chefs who write them that I would give more authority to and choose over others. Or maybe it's about when it was published. If it was published many, many years ago, perhaps it's not as relevant today and is more out of date. And what are the credentials of the people who wrote the books? Does that affect how we use the publications? The Bible, if we come back to the Bible, is a historical document, a rule of life, an interesting work of fiction. It can be described in many different ways. And how much authority do we give to the Bible? Who wrote it? When? Why? For whom? Lots of questions and multiple different answers. As it's like a library in itself, as we know, of 66 different books, with your Old Testament and Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, all with different purposes and ideas, both when it was written and how it's used today. Are there passages in the Bible then that hold special meaning for us? Or are there ones that we definitely avoid? Authorship is another tricky question when we're looking at the Bible. Some books, such as Hebrews, the author is unknown. Others, like Galatians, it's generally agreed was written by Paul. Books written at different times and in different contexts, and this can be important when looking at passages of scripture and seeking to apply and interpret them for our current context. So those are just, I say just a few, quite a few questions that Module 2 raises for us, and we will touch on in today's session. So just before we go into groups, I'm just going to invite you to have a look at a passage of scripture with me and to ask some of the questions that we've been thinking about. So I've chosen this passage of scripture, which is in the worship, learning and preaching module to do just this task with. When a man or woman has white spots on the skin, the priest is to examine them, and if the spots are dull white, it is a harmless rash that has broken out on the skin. They are clean. A man who has lost his hair and is bald is clean. If he has lost his hair from the front of his scalp and has a bald forehead, he is clean. But if he has a reddish-white sore on his bald head or forehead, it is a defiling disease breaking out on his head or forehead. The priest is to examine him, and if the swollen sore on his head or forehead is reddish-white like a defiling skin disease, the man is diseased and is unclean. The priest shall pronounce him unclean because of the sore on his head. Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face and cry out, unclean, unclean. An interesting passage, especially as my husband's bald. So some of these questions that we might look at when we're looking at a passage of scripture such as that. So should it be read as part of a larger whole, or is it a standalone section? Well, clearly I've taken that out of context, and really it needs to be read as part of a larger whole. Passages from chapter 13 of Leviticus and chapters 13 and 14 deal with regulations involving skin conditions and afflictions, most likely leprosy. There is quite a bit of linguistic detail around the translation of the Hebrew word for skin diseases and its translation into Greek, for those who would be interested in such matters, but time does not allow me to dwell on that, but that is a section as something that could be looked at. So if we're saying that it's referring to leprosy or types of skin disease, leprosy is often described as the oldest disease in the world. It's a contagious and disfiguring disease that was prevalent in the time that the passage was written. To avoid spreading the disease, it was important to identify it, then to isolate, and also make others aware that you had the disease in order to keep away and so preserve the health of the community as a whole. I wonder if that's ringing any bells for us this morning. As someone who's just had COVID, and I happened to tell somebody at the airport the other day I'd had COVID, and he immediately took a step back from me, even though he was more than 2 meters away. Very much had this sense of being unclean. And so if we were writing a chapter of Leviticus for today, detailing the instructions for dealing with COVID, they would not be too dissimilar, I suggest. Just the means are slightly different. Identify, test, isolate, let your contacts know, do lateral flows on days 6 and 7 to show that you are now clean. However, it is health workers who do the diagnostics, not the priest, which I think the ministers among us might be thankful for. And so it's important to see that that's part of a whole passage of instruction and guidance for people. Coming to the second question, is it fact or fiction? I guess we would say it's a factual account of what would be done in that situation and how to deal with it. The writer expected people to read it and to obey it, to read it as guidance, as information of how to deal with things. This is what you need to look for. This is what you need to do. clearly, I don't think it's a story to be enjoyed. It's very much guidance about, and it was a very difficult thing in that time, that if you had leprosy, then your life was pretty much over and you had to isolate. And then, does it make the readers behave in a particular way? It's trying to encourage people to keep the whole community well by taking responsibility for oneself and isolating. And so what's its relevance for us today? Now we know a lot more about leprosy and skin diseases and how it's spread, and that actually it isn't as contagious as it was believed to be. There is now treatment available, and it is a curable disease, around 200,000 cases a year still, and in some countries it's been eradicated. As a bit of a sidewinder, those of you who may have read The Island by Victoria Hislop, which is a really interesting novel around the leper colony on Spinalonga in Crete, which only closed in the 1970s. So we may not need such detailed instructions today around skin afflictions and leprosy, but I think the passage is still important, as already noted with our current infectious disease around, that there are principles behind the passage that are still relevant. It's important to have guidance to follow around infectious disease, to follow it in order to express our loving concern for our neighbour. So I just very quick trot through a short passage and hopefully quite topical and relevant, looking at a scripture passage. And so now we're going to, as Jill said, go into our breakout rooms and get to know each other a little bit better and have a look at some questions around the Bible and translations.
All right then, let's take a look at a few topics arising in this section. We'll begin with a quick look over some of the history from 20 centuries BC up until shortly after the birth of Jesus and the settings for the scriptures written in this time. It's a huge spread of history. It takes in the rise and fall of various empires, the development of city-states, the spread of alphabet and written language as the principal medium of communication. And thus, things that go along with that are the emergence of codified legal systems. We see the start of the Iron Age and progression with new technologies. There are political intrigues and alliances. There's war and there's peace. So the period from 20 centuries BC up until 13th century BC, the Middle to Late Bronze Age, also known as the Patriarchal period, as it begins with Abraham travelling from the major civilization of Ur, and it takes us through the centuries, through from the Exodus from Egypt with the leadership of Moses and Joshua. And so by the time we get to the entry into the Promised Land, we're at the very start of the Iron Age. 1 Samuel, a few centuries on, shows some of the political dimensions to this new technology and how it can be controlled. After Joshua comes the era of the judges, a non-hereditary system of government, which is unusual compared to the surrounding empires, usually, following a family line. And so by the 10th century BC, a monarchy has been established, uniting all of the Israelite tribes, firstly under King Saul, then David, and then Solomon. This is short-lived, however, and about 928 BC, at the death of Solomon, the kingdom splits into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. You'll be forgiven for getting a bit confused about the way the Bible uses this word Israel, because sometimes Israel is the us, and the Bible earlier on is written from the viewpoint of Israel as the people of God. But by now, Israel is that distinct, separate entity, not the kingdom of Judah, but the kingdom to the north, with its own political alliances being made. This division creates an exploitable weakness, and 3 years later, Egyptian Pharaoh Shishak invades Jerusalem and carries away treasures from the temple. And so into this precarious political situation, we move into the 9th century. And we get the rise of the prophets, starting with Elijah and Elisha. And through the 8th century, we get others such as Amos and Hosea. 100 years after the Egyptian invasion from the southwest, there is a conquest by the Assyrians to the north, who invade and destroy the kingdom of Israel, but not the kingdom of Judah. 20 years on from that, Jerusalem will be unsuccessfully besieged by Assyria. And so over the following century, the threat from Assyria actually starts to vanish, but this is the calm before the storm, as Babylon further east is growing in strength and emerging as the dominant superpower, a claim which is cemented in 612 BC, when the Assyrian capital Nineveh is captured. It's only a matter of time before Jerusalem is then in Babylon's sights, attacked in 597 and captured in 586. The temple is destroyed, the city walls are destroyed, and the people are deported. But by the end of the 6th century, the exile has officially ended, and so from 538 BC, exiles have begun to return and rebuild the city and the temple. The population remained divided, however, with some being eager to return and build a new life in what had been Judea, and others happy to stay where they are, with children and grandchildren having been born there. Our Bibles present this contrast. In Ezra and Nehemiah, we hear about the return from exile and the importance of creating ethnically distinct families. Directly following this is Esther, with a Jewish community remaining in the exiled lands and mixing with the communities there and the local population. The 5th to the 3rd centuries are given over to the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the subsequent adaptation necessary to the new Hellenic or Greek influence, as Alexander the Great has taken over and become the new dominant force, and the Greek Empire is the new superpower. In the 2nd century, all this turns sour with the persecution of the Jews and the subsequent revolt led by Judas Maccabeus, and recorded in the books of the Maccabees. The festival of Hanukkah, known in John 10 as the Feast of Dedication, celebrates and commemorates these events. As we move into the 1st century, we see the rise of the Roman Empire displacing the Greek, and puppet kings being set up as kings of Judea. Herod begins the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple again, and it's then that Jesus was born, with the Roman period forming the backdrop to the New Testament. Revolt against Rome leads to the subsequent capture of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the destruction of the temple, an event which affects some of the writing of the New Testament. It's a whistle-stop tour through some of the history that surrounds the Bible. And in it we touch on a few matters which relate to what books of the Bible are next to one another, and some books which maybe you might not be familiar. So, what books are in the Bible? Does it matter what order they're in? Well, for most of Christian history, the New Testament has been broadly consistent, so we'll look at the Old. When we do this, we tend to talk about a canon or a canonical order. A canon comes from a Greek word which means reed or cane, more easily remembered perhaps, which was used as a measuring device and provided a regular standard. So when we talk about the canon of the Bible, we're talking about a regular standard, these specific texts in this specific order. Except, of course, it's rarely quite so straightforward, and different groups have different canons. What we use as the Old Testament comes ultimately from the Jewish Bible, which is called the Tanakh. Tanakh is an acronym made from the first 3 letters of the 3 sections of the Bible: the Torah, the law, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. Tanakh. And in the Tanakh there are 24 individual books, which might not be as many as you expect. For Protestants, the Old Testament is 39 books, which broadly goes the books of the law, the history of ancient Israel, wisdom through poetry and proverbs, and concludes with the prophets, which look forward to the coming of Jesus and John the Baptist. So at the end of Malachi, we turn the page to Matthew 1, and it all continues rather seamlessly. The books are in a different order to the Jewish Tanakh, but the 39 comes from splitting some of the Jewish books to multiple books. So 1 and 2 Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, and 12 individual small prophetic books, Jonah, Amos, Malachi, etc., rather than one book of minor prophets. But the texts are the same. In Roman Catholicism, it's a bit different, and the Roman Catholic canon contains all the books of the Protestant canon and a few others, such as the books of the Maccabees, which we mentioned. These books are sometimes called the Apocrypha, and others refer to them by the label Deuterocanonical, second canon. Section C of the Learn material shows where these feature in the order, and this brings the total in the Roman Catholic Old Testament to 42 books. Greek Orthodox brothers and sisters have a subtly different canon yet again, and it varies as to which of these apocryphal texts to use, and whether something is one book or multiple books. And so the Greek Orthodox Old Testament has 49 books. Perhaps more interesting than noting the number of books is to note the order of the books. Does Ruth follow Judges, because both are historical texts that fill in the gaps of history and transition us from the charismatic leadership of individuals to the hereditary leadership of King David's family? Or are they separate books in completely different bits of the Bible, because Judges is a prophetic book about the work of God raising up individuals for a task, and Ruth is a festival book for use at harvest festivals to help people celebrate? The formation of these canons and their ordering developed over a number of centuries, which is not unlike some of the texts themselves. And although some were likely written in their entirety at one time, the letters of Paul, for example, others perhaps weren't, and the text that we've received may have developed over a period of time. And when we want to think about who authored the Bible, it might actually be helpful to think of something like who authored the local paper this week, or the Sunday paper if you read a Sunday paper. Well, the name overall might be the name of the editor, who's ultimately associated with all that's contained within, and may have tweaked any of the articles contained. There may be sub-editors as well who did a bit more organisation and retweaking. And they've collected work written by individual journalists who wrote the articles and maybe whose names are associated with them. But perhaps the journalists have filled their articles with quotes from other sources and people they've spoken to related to the topic. So is it fair to say that those are the people who wrote the article and the journalists have tweaked it and then the editors have tweaked that? Who wrote it? Was it the last editor to tweak it and give the final polish? Was it the journalist whose words have been changed, perhaps by someone else? Or was it the person who gave the quotes to the journalist in the first place? There may be one named author to an article, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's entirely one person's work. And so whatever extent we claim that God authored the scriptures, we recognise that others are involved as well. And the Bible, in that sense, is a bit like a newspaper. The ancient world was a predominantly oral culture. Information, be it history, poetry, or stories, was commonly shared vocally rather than in a written format. Not everyone can read or write, and writing is a burdensome activity that requires materials and time. In an oral culture, there has to be a good reason to write something down. In the New Testament, Paul's letters are often responses arising out of a need in a congregation, or he writes because he's in prison and can't otherwise be with them. Some of the early history in the Bible seems to have been written down at the time of the exile, when there was a perceived need. There was a fear that some of the information that for centuries had been passed on through word of mouth might get lost in all the turmoil of deportation. And so there are particularly large chunks of the Old Testament which seem unlikely to have been written down in the format that we know them at the time that they report, but rather later on. The book of Esther acknowledges this. At the beginning it says, all this happened in the days of King Xerxes or King Ahasuerus, suggesting it was written sometime after that king had died. And so these texts seem to have been written down at a later time, when there was a crisis, such as being in exile. And that there was a need then to get these words safely secure on paper, rather than trusting the oral tradition to continue. And we know some of the authors of the Bible, but many are anonymous. So I wonder, as we go into a time of questions and discussion, does this bother you? Can you work out why or why not that might be the case? Does it matter to you to know who each author was, or are you comfortable to accept that these texts have faithfully been handed on and we might not know? Other questions you might use for prompts as discussion are, well, in what ways does the wider history of the ancient Near East help us understand the Bible? Were there any surprises for you? If we look at the canon, were you aware that there are different canons for different groups and the biblical canon is not always consistent? Do these differences bother you? I wonder, if we think about the different canonical order, have a look at the very last verses in the Jewish Tanakh and the very last verses in the Protestant Old Testament, because they're not the same. What are the different unfulfilled hopes in 2 Chronicles 36 and in Malachi 3? What difference does it make to finish with either set of words, or to move into the New Testament having concluded with those words? You might have other questions you wish to discuss as well.
We haven't got time now to take on those questions which David finished with, but it may be that your local preachers meeting, or that a group of you want to get together, watch the video again, and pick up on some of those discussion topics. We have just 5 minutes now if anybody does have a question for Rabbi David to address, following on from any of what he's just shared with us. But I recognize there was a huge amount there. While people are thinking, David, okay, so I've got a question for you, because that may have daunted some of us somewhat. And I'm hoping that you didn't do all that from memory, that you were using a script. We don't all need to remember all of that, do we? But what do we need to, and how does it impact upon our preaching and leading of worship?
I definitely had a script, which I spent a bit of time trying to whittle down, so there was some level of information that didn't, take too long. There was over 2,000 years of history we got through in 10 minutes there, which you could spend a lot more time on. You don't need to remember all of that. Get hold of a book, or the New Oxford Annotated Bible has a helpful little timeline at the back with, if you want to refer to and go, oh, I wonder what's happening at this time, and it tells you some useful things. So no, don't worry about remembering all the dates. But in terms of preaching, I think it is helpful to remember that these texts, it's easy, or it can be easy, to just open the Bible and read the text as that's the context that they're in. And remember, actually, they come from a whole load of other things going on. And that as the prophets were challenging the kings, or as the kings were doing things, or whatever was happening, there was all this political world around them. And that they were constantly having to look southwest to Egypt to see what the pharaohs were doing. And if the relationship between Judah and Israel was going wrong, then Egypt might be coming in, and they were worrying about that, or worrying about Assyria, or worrying about Babylon. And that this affects how people speak and write, and what their concerns are in that moment. If you watch an old version of Have I Got News for You or something, think, oh yeah, that was really important 2 years ago and I'd forgotten about it, but it was really a live issue at the time, and we'll look back in 2 years' time at things that are happening this week and go, oh yeah, some things will have lingered and other things will have dropped off the scene. And I think that just helps shape our preaching, that these words are connecting with issues that really affected people that were sometimes out of their control.
So far, we've been looking at the Bible. We've been looking at its content. We've been looking at the history. But now we're going to look at how we look at the Bible, what we do when we read it. I'm sure most of us read the Bible. We'll pick it off the shelf, open it, read the words. But when we approach the Bible, we do so through certain lenses, through certain ways of reading. That is what hermeneutics means in basics, how we read it, what approach we take. For those who can remember back to school and looking at a Shakespeare play and having to dissect it, work out what's there, what is being said and how it's been said and who says it. That is part of our hermeneutic. It's the approach we take when trying to read the text. There are multiple different types of hermeneutic, and probably since I last looked at a list, there's probably half a dozen more sprouted up. And each of us will have our personal hermeneutic, our personal way of reading. It'll be shaped by who we are, what we've done. You can have a heavily theological hermeneutic. I would almost be sure that David, with his understanding of the history and the scope and of the biblical texts, would have a very different hermeneutic to myself. But it's our way of reading. For some, it'll be a hermeneutic informed by a particular form of theology. There are liberation theologians' hermeneutic of reading. There is feminist hermeneutics. Very well-studied Black, Asian, and other hermeneutics based on cultural groups or origins, quite often reading into the text from their cultural view. And that's to remind us that there is even probably a Scottish hermeneutic, a British hermeneutic, and we may not recognize it. We've mentioned Ruth and Esther a few times, and picking up on Ruth. A feminist hermeneutic of Ruth would read about Ruth and what happens with her in a male-dominated world. A liberation hermeneutic may look at what happened to the poor and the downtrodden in it. A hermeneutic of exclusion would look at what happens when the immigrant comes into a country. Hermeneutics are the lens through which we read the text. And we do need to be aware that we read through a lens, even when we don't think we are, even when we think that we are just reading the Bible. We're still informed by who we are, what we've done before, the context of our church. Most of us, I would hope, would apply some Methodist hermeneutic, though we'd probably all disagree on what that was. So to remind us to concluding that a hermeneutic is the lens through which we read the text. It is the way we engage with it. It is what we find in it. For more on hermeneutics, I direct you towards exercise 9 in the Learn section of Worship Leading and Preaching, where there'll be a section to read from the work of David Holgate and Rachel Starr on biblical hermeneutics, and some questions to reflect on. But to keep in mind that we very rarely will read the text neutrally. We all come to it with an approach, and to be conscious and cognizant of that is a vital part for all who preach and lead worship. So I think I'm handing back to you now, Jill.
Thank you, James. That was really helpful. Thank you. So if that was a new word to you, anybody today, hermeneutics, the challenge is to get it into a sentence before the end of the day.
Hello. We're going to talk this morning about the passage in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verses 35 and to the end. It's a familiar passage for many people. It's titled, Jesus Calms the Storm. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him."
You see, I think this is one of those passages that has almost exactly the opposite effect on congregations now as it was intended to have. I think the real challenge of this passage is the miracle. How can this happen? And Mark reads so straightforwardly that this reads like a historical account. And it's very difficult for, certainly my mind, but I suspect many modern sceptical minds steeped in history and science to get past the calming of the waves and to think, well, what does this mean? It doesn't do, wow, isn't Jesus great? It says, how on earth can this have happened?
Yes. But there are lots of things happening there. I mean, I hadn't noticed before that there were other boats going, and I don't know what the significance of that is. But what is significant is they were heading into Gentile territory, and not just on the edge of the water where they could suddenly escape. They were heading to inland where the Gentiles were around, and maybe they were as much afraid or more afraid of who they were going to meet and the reaction of those people than they were of whatever the physical storm may or may not have been.
So perhaps there's something then in the detail of the story that can sort of take us beyond the sort of the physical circumstances of the storm to what the internal storm of the disciples might have been at that time, mm-hmm. what they were going to face in the Gentile country.
Yeah, I think we lose a lot if we just take passages in the Bible as simple stories.
I certainly agree. I think that the difficulty very often is how to get beyond that. And and I think what you said there, which was helpful for me, was thinking about the internal context of the story, of looking at the detail of where this boat was going, the fact that there were other boats, and then to imagine ourselves into what internal storm the disciples might be feeling, which then enables us to take the step for ourselves, is to think about what internal storms might we be facing.
Because throughout the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are still struggling to work out who Jesus is, what his role is, and this person who they're obviously attracted to, but we really weren't sure which direction they were heading. And not having that surety in the boat where they, you've got someone that you admire and you want to be with them, but you're not sure what it's going to be like when you get there.
So one of the questions we can ask as we approach this passage is, who do we identify with? By identifying with the disciples, we can sort of break open that uncertainty in ourselves as we're asking, who's Jesus? I suppose we could also think about identifying with Jesus and what perspective that would give us on on the story. But either way, lifts us out of our sort of detached view of the story, of thinking of this as history. It draws us into the story and helps us to explore the motivations, the characters, the questions that are being asked.
Yeah. And I think that the disciples weren't comfortable, weren't knowing, didn't know where they were going, where they were heading, what was going to happen to them. And that's like us in our lives, isn't it? You know, we hope that we are looking at Jesus and following his way, but there's always that uncertainty. So where are we really heading? And where is our comfort? What can we look to find? But also the reassurance that we can get help and support and feel we are heading in the right direction.
And I suppose that's really brought to life in the story by the disciples' reaction to the storm. That the accusation to Jesus, don't you care about us? We're going to perish. Why don't you do something? Which connects in my mind with a number of the Psalms, where the psalmist is saying, "Where are you, God? Wake up, come to my aid." And that too is something that we can identify with. That our faith may be there or already in Jesus, and with an expectation that we will be supported by God's love, but all the evidence in front of us might be stacking up against that.
It shows the importance of getting the background of where you're going, and actually, in this instance, actually looking at a map of the Sea of Galilee and the surrounding areas, and realise who was controlling what and coming in, so that there's a little bit more of a feeling. There's not the detachment of a single story just set on its own. It's the context is really important in that. So
the sort of exegesis of context can help us to enter into the story and the motivations of the people in the story, rather than sort of reading it from a distance.
And then when you're actually talking about it within church, whether it's leading an informal worship session or in the sermon, then you look at what your congregation might feel and explore some of the issues that the disciples could have faced, which could be very similar to the ones we're facing. How does that fit with your congregation and what their needs are?
Yes, and I suppose as always with a congregation, those needs will be diverse. There'll be some people in the midst of a storm. There'll be others who are just past, coming out of the storm, and maybe feeling the quiet. And there'll be those who are saying, well, what storm?
Yes.
And I suppose that there might be angles there which would be unhelpful for people in a congregation. Maybe by focusing too much on Jesus and our presumption that he can still sort everything out. There's a disempowering there, maybe, where we're in the midst of a storm and we're faced with lots of options. To be told, well, just rely on Jesus, he'll sort it out for you, might be profoundly unhelpful.
Yes.
And might not be a word of comfort in that particular storm.
Yes, some people it would be comforting, but for many others they might feel that they failed if relying on Jesus doesn't produce what they see as relying on Jesus doesn't produce any good at all. But we've been given hearts and minds and bodies by God to actually be part of the solution and not just there waiting to be helped and supported in whatever way.
So perhaps, thinking of that, perhaps the key action that those disciples took was actually being in the boat.
They'd gone one step.
They'd gone one step, and then they were having to live with the consequences. of that.
Yeah.
And they were already in the boat when the storm started. And yes, they might think, they might wish they hadn't been in the boat, but they were already in that boat. And so they have some agency there. Jesus didn't make them get in the boat, they chose to be in that boat. And in making the demands of Jesus to save them, they're expressing a justifiable anxiety. And perhaps that's helpful to hear when we're in the midst of a storm, in the same way that it's helpful to hear the psalmist accusing God of being absent, that there's a permission giving there, that Jesus didn't prevent the storm from happening. I suppose that would be the response to where we were a moment ago in expecting Jesus to sort it all out for us. In a sense that the disciples don't have the optimum situation. The optimum situation would have been no storm. Yes.
But then wouldn't life be boring if you didn't have to strive against something, as if it was just really...
Yes, there's certain aspects of life which I could quite do with a bit of boredom. But it is a fact of life that there are storms.
Yes.
And it is I suppose it is an accusation that's or a question that's often asked of people of faith as to well, why doesn't your God prevent these storms from happening? Which puts us, which causes us to question our understanding of God. Is this omnipotent, omniscient God a supernatural being that waves wands and makes things happen or makes them not happen? Or is the God we see on the cross the God that is there beside us in times of suffering, in storms?
Abiding in, and us abiding is where I get my comfort in times of trouble.
Yes, and there is Jesus abiding with the disciples in the boat. This isn't Jesus hovering over the waters as the Spirit hovered over the waters of creation, detached from the problem. It is Jesus there alongside the disciples in the boat.
So. Yes. When I was looking online earlier at the new worship leading and preaching course, I found a prayer by C. Harlan Davis, which I thought summed up some of the issues with Scripture and particularly this passage, but many other passages too. And I'd like to close with that.
Thank you. Yeah, that'd be really helpful, because when we're talking about preaching, we're not just talking about sermonizing. And very often prayer is a really helpful way of holding difficult passages and holding contradictions and getting beyond the logic of it in order to respond in a different way. So let's share this prayer.
O God, you show us your love in so many ways. Help us to find your love in Scripture, in the stories of your people, in the stories of your Son, in the stories which challenge or encourage us, in your story. Help us to find your love in the world, in the lives of those who work for your glory, in the lives of those for whom life is struggling and suffering, in the life of your church, in your life. And help us to find your love in ourselves, when our lives touch the lives of others, when we are creating or resting, when we are working or playing, when all is going well or everything seems against us. We are yours. God of love and beauty, weave that love into a beautiful pattern in our lives. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, James.
Indeed, thank you both. David. over to you for a little summary.
Thank you. So, we draw to a close today. We've gone through a number of different things there, from looking at the origin of the text, what caused them to be written, some of the things within them, and how across the different contexts we might use them. Being okay with recognizing that we'll read things which don't always sit well with us, and thinking about the hermeneutics there of, well, why might that be the case? Are there others who would respond differently, and why or why not? And all of this then features in the what's the word for it? The project brief, which invites you to do a little bit of work on a gospel passage, just to get started with thinking about how we move from having this passage in the Bible in conversation with you, to you having a conversation about the passage with others, whatever that might be, either in a service or a Bible study, or to form prayers, or develop your own reflections. So you're invited to take a gospel reading, either from a service you're going to be involved in, or there's a selection of passages, if given things as they are at the moment, getting around to taking a service soon is not either the course you're on or is not possible. You might just say a few words about what's caused you to select that passage and what it means to you before you get into it. There are some questions given to help you get into exploring the meaning of the text. What's the genre? What's the structure? What are the key ideas? How do you find yourself drawn in? Look at a few translations and see if there's anything that comes out as slightly different, that sort of thing. And then, having started there are some ways to then take that a bit further, go into a bit more detail using Bible commentaries, not just how the text is in conversation with you, but what other conversations of other people have as they've read this passage, and what might you learn from that. So hopefully, even if you don't have many commentaries on your bookshelves, in your circuits or environment, there'll be others around who can hopefully lend you and recommend good commentaries to borrow. And as you do that, the questions then go a bit deeper beyond the sort of the factual to a bit more deeper meaning. So where is the good news then in the passage? Are there still things that are bothering you or surprising you? Those sorts of questions. And then to put those into a short little reflection. And once you've done that, you will have an exegesis of a passage. It won't be all there is to say on the passage. It won't be all there is that you would want to say. You might have other questions that go further, but a little framework here to get you going on moving from the passage in conversation with you to how you might take that to having a conversation with others. We started, I think, that wasn't the first words that was said, I want to share the good news. Here's one way that helps us get into taking that passage to sharing the good news from it in a conversation with others in a variety of formats.
Thank you, David. So we've reached 11 o'clock, which is the end of our time. I know there's been lots to take in today. So do keep checking the material once it's up on the video channel, and go into the course online. All the instructions for how to get into the course are on that introductory video to help you through, but otherwise just contact one of us if you need a little bit of help with that. And so the project brief that David was just outlining there, that all comes from Module 2, Section 1 of the course. So we meet next time on the 5th of February in this way. And so we hope to see you again then. And one of the words we'll be tackling then is the word David's just used, exegesis. Don't be frightened of it, it'll soon be your best friend. It's all about looking more closely at the text. So thank you for being with us today. As I say, please do feedback how we can do this better, how we can meet your needs, and do seek local support and local contacts as well to guide you on this exploration, this journey of encountering God together. Every blessing. Thanks for joining us.